Jake here from IBPF. Thank you for joining today's webinar, Sleep and Bipolar Disorder, Challenges and Management Tips. We are honored to be joined by Dr. Greg Murray, Director of Mood Disorder Research and Practice at Swinburne University of Technology, Melbourne, Australia. Professor Murray has an international reputation for clinical psychology research. He's ranked in the top 1% of bipolar disorder researchers worldwide, having published more than 200 articles, chapters, and books on mood disorders. There will be a 15-minute question and answer session at the end of the talk, and you may type in your questions at any time throughout the presentation. Dr. Murray, thank you so much for joining us today. It truly is a pleasure.
Thanks very much, Jake, and thanks for your help with the technical challenges before we went launched today. I've got a new laptop here, and of course there's 16 layers of settings that I didn't know how to find my way through. And so Jake's going to help us today by advancing the slides. So the slides are sitting on his computer, not mine. Hey, welcome everyone to today's talk. This is probably my favorite topic to talk about. I have had an interest in sleep and the body clock for years and years and years. And I've been studying bipolar disorder for years and years and years. And I have a family history of bipolar disorder, and I myself warrant a diagnosis of a mild bipolar disorder. That's why I got interested in the field in the first place. But you might also be able to see here, I'm in my music room. And so my first career was as a drummer. And I still play drums. I had a really good gig last weekend. But the interest in drumming is where I got you'll see it during the talk. I have a particular way of thinking about sleep and wake that is to do with rhythms. And it's literally how I got interested in the whole sleep aspect of bipolar disorder. But you'll notice that in the talk. Next point, please, Jake. So what we're going to cover is we're going to introduce you to the very well-known challenges that people face in regards to sleep when they have bipolar disorder. And really the take home is going to be pretty much that sleep challenges are part and parcel of mood disorders generally, but particularly bipolar disorder. And there's been a whole lot of research done into it because it's really intrinsic, these sleep challenges. There are probably very few people who have a bipolar disorder diagnosis who don't have some issues with their sleep. What we're going to talk about today then, of course, we're not just going to hang around with the problems. We're going to talk about making things better. And I'm a psychologist, not a medical practitioner, so I don't know much about medications. So we're not going to talk about them. So we're going to talk about non-pharmacological options for improving sleep. And we're going to do a little bit of background about how sleep works as the basis for working out what strategies might be useful. And most of the talk is actually focused on self-management, things people can do themselves. But of course, in the context of bipolar disorder, we have to remember that things can get a bit out of whack. So sometimes professional involvement is going to be required for the sleep problems of bipolar disorder. Remembering that the sleep problems of bipolar disorder are deeply connected to the mood and energy symptoms. So, if I was talking to a group of people who didn't have problems with their mood, then I'd probably just talk about self-management. I might mention, there are doctors you can see if that doesn't work. But with people who have mood problems, that close connection between sleep and the mood problems means that we do have to always keep in mind that self-management may not be enough. And we're going to be talking about what you might be on the lookout for to see if your self-management strategies actually aren't working and it's time to get an appointment with your health practitioner. And then finally, I just want to make it really clear that, I'm talking about bipolar disorder here, but of course, everyone with bipolar disorder is different. They're all just people and they happen to have these challenges. But today I'm talking in terms of general principles for people with bipolar disorder. And that's not the same thing as speaking to an individual about their sleep problems. So this is not clinical advice for anyone. These are general ideas that might be useful. At the end of today's talk, I'm going to present some more resources for you to follow up. But ultimately, I'm assuming that everyone on this call who has bipolar disorder is actually under the care of a health practitioner. And so if this talk is interesting to you, one of the things you might want to do is raise some of those ideas with your health practitioner, who can help you think about the implications of today's talk for you, because obviously I can't do that because I'm not speaking to individuals and asking about your situation. But nonetheless, I think it's useful to talk in these general terms about things we know generally that might be useful for people with bipolar disorder. And throughout today's slides, you'll see I'm a bit of a Van Gogh fan, and this is the first image from Van Gogh. Next point, please, Jake. So, yeah, thanks. So this is a general thing. If we had 3 or 4 hours, which I'd happily use to talk about this, we'd spend an hour on this, about just human sleep. And one of the things that I find really interesting about human sleep is, someone pointed out to me a few years ago, it is very interesting that evolution has decided that for about a third of every 24-hour period, human beings are disconnected from the environment. It seems like a high risk thing to do, right? Most species have a phase of the day where they rest, but not all species sleep. Sleep is not just resting, it's actually closing off your information from the environment. And given that evolution's only interest is in keeping you alive and keeping you procreating, getting your genes through to the next generation, this seems like a big investment in sleep, right? And this is why, there's a sort of theoretical reason why people think sleep must be really important, that for a third of the day, we're not keeping an eye out for threats. We're not keeping an eye out for rewards and opportunities to strengthen the chances for our genes to get through to the next generation. We are doing this sleep thing. And a lot of this is now common sense, but I just think that's a really interesting way to think about sleep. It's kind of important as far as evolution is concerned. And so what happens when we sleep is, firstly, we have physical recuperation. So we get protein synthesis and growth hormones are secreted, and there's all sorts of functions around just maintaining the body's physical status. That happens mainly during the slow wave, deep sleep phases of sleep. If we had time, I'd talk about it. Sleep is not just one thing. There are different stages within sleep which have different roles, actually, but we don't have time to unpack that. Next point, please, Jake. The other thing that there's been a lot of research on over the last 20 years is the importance for cognition, for how well we can think about things. And this is just one famous stat. There's lots of studies, but I just think this captures it very nicely. So after 19 hours without sleep, firstly, let's just think what that is. What is that? Is that unusual? Well, it is a bit, but it's not dramatically unusual. So if you imagine one day you woke up at 6 a.m., so it's an early start, and you go through to 6 p.m., that's 12 hours. You go through to midnight, that's 18 hours. 1 a.m. is 19 hours. Now, we would all call that a long day, right? But we wouldn't assume that that's damaged our cognitive function by 1 a.m. But in fact, it has. After 19 hours without sleep, our performance is worse than 0.05 blood alcohol content, which in Australia is the legal limit on driving. So yeah, basically, if you've had that long day and it's now 1 a.m. and someone says to you, can you drive down to the 7-Eleven and get some milk? Your answer should be no, because I really don't think I'm up to it. So the things that are challenged in cognition are attention, concentration, and what we call executive functioning, which is that sort of planning. What do I do first? What do I do next? That stuff that is easy to do when we're well rested becomes very difficult to do when we're not well rested. Next point, please, Jake. And then, of course, the very famous thing of emotion regulation, which everyone knows. Everyone who has had a bad night's sleep knows that the first thing you notice is you are irritable. If things don't go your way, it's very hard to be flexible with things that don't go your way. You'll snap at the cat if the cat meows too much. We just are under-resourced in terms of responding to things that don't work. But the other thing that's not so obvious, that people aren't so conscious of, is so we get that increase in negative emotions, but we also get a decrease in positive emotions. So it's not so obvious because it's something missing, not something that's increased. But one of the things we get if we don't have enough sleep is we get more of I don't know if everyone around the world uses this phrase, but it's really common in Australia. The can't be bothered's, like I can't be bothered doing that thing. And some people in the UK say I can't be asked. And it means I don't have what it really means is I've done a little unconscious calculation about the rewards versus costs of doing this thing. And it turns out to be not worth doing. And so, for example, on a day where haven't slept well, you remember you're a bit irritable because of the increase in negative emotions. But say one of your friends says, "Hey, tonight we're going to that movie. We've all been waiting for it to come out. We've decided to go tonight. Do you want to come?" After one night without sleep, you might be functioning okay, but again, subconsciously, you've got this sort of emotional tone where you can't quite imagine how much fun that's going to be, right? So you don't have access to the positive emotion that you should be feeling when your mates say, "We've been looking forward to this film for weeks. It's finally out." You say, "Oh, yeah, no, I might pass on that." And of course, that saying no to potentially rewarding activities is part of a depressive cycle, isn't it? Right? That is absolutely one of the definitions of depression, that we start to say no to potentially rewarding activities. Consequence of that is we miss out on that rewarding, connecting activity, and we also get more opportunity to spend time by ourselves, which gives us chances to ruminate, which we all know is part of that depressive spiral. So these are just comments that I make when I'm talking to anyone about sleep. This is not specific to bipolar disorder, none of these points. This is just how sleep works. Now we're going to talk about sleep in bipolar disorder. Thanks, Jake. And next point, thank you, that's great. So fundamentally, and this is what we need to notice first, there is a two-way relationship between sleep and most mental health problems. I'm not aware of a mental health problem that doesn't have an interaction with sleep. Could be anxiety, could be PTSD, could be ADHD, could be schizophrenia. There's, bodies of work on the sleep component and the interplay between sleep and every one of those challenges that people experience. Neurodiversity, very, very common issues. That's what we're going to be talking about. And this is that thing I just flagged before, that because of how I see the world in terms of rhythms. For me, sleep is just the other side of the coin to wake, right? They're part of a 24-hour cycle that nature has built. It's like a pulse. It's like a 24-hour pulse or rhythm. And so, of course, right, if someone has a diagnosis of a mental health problem, we diagnose it primarily on what's happening in the daytime. That's just because that's when humans are around to look at things. But of course, it's going to have manifestations overnight. The 24-hour cycle is just one thing. And it's actually, you'll see in a minute, it's quite useful not to think about sleep as separate from the waking day. It's not a separate thing. It's all part of one thing. And we'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. But that's going to be the take-home message for this section, is watch out for that interplay between the two. Next point, please. So I'm going to introduce you to 6 ways in which bipolar disorder is linked to sleep, and they're all sort of different. So firstly, as most of you will know, changes in sleep are part of the diagnosis, right? So episodes of depression and episodes of mania and hypomania, they include sleep changes as part of the syndrome that defines the diagnosis. But when you go and check how frequently do people in those states experience sleep problems, it's the diagnosis looks like it's right. 100% of people who are depressed with bipolar disorder who are currently depressed report insomnia. And typically that's middle and late insomnia, that is waking in the night and not being able to get to sleep, or waking like too early and not being able to get back to sleep, as opposed to what we call early insomnia, difficulty falling asleep. It's middle and late insomnia that is the most common. But, things are complicated, and almost 80% report hypersomnia. That is, problems with oversleeping, spending too long in bed, or feeling like they need more sleep. During mania and hypomania, about a quarter or a third meet criteria for insomnia. Insomnia meaning not being able to get to sleep when you want to, or stay asleep when you want to, or feeling like your sleep has not been refreshing. That's what insomnia means. But of course, we also get, and people on this call will know this, we get decreased need for sleep. People say, I'm full of beans. Don't need to stop, don't need to rest. I can just push on. And that, that combination of insomnia, not being able to get to sleep, and sometimes not feeling you need to sleep, adds up to a sort of pattern of short and disrupted sleep, whether it's to do with not feeling like you can't get to sleep or you don't want to get to sleep. You end up with this short, disrupted sleep. The people with bipolar disorder often describe it as tired but wired. So they feel tired, but there's kind of like the starter motor is still going. It's a very sort of unpleasant state, and obviously not conducive to sleep, right? But the other thing we know is that between episodes, people with bipolar disorder really are people who have ongoing issues with sleep. The majority report ongoing sleep problems, and in between episodes, hypersomnia is the most common thing that people are reporting, which of course leads to challenges with work and relationships, and connecting with other people. If you're not sleeping in the same way that the average person is sleeping, that has flow-on effects. Next point, please, Jack. Oh, yeah, this is another thing that research has discovered that's really important, that people with bipolar disorder tend to be evening types. So this, I presume most people have heard of this. This is that some people call it larks and owls, and some people call it morningness, eveningness. Scientists call it chronotype. And what it means is where you prefer to have your sleep and wake, right? So some of us are earlier than others. Some of us get up, 6 o'clock in the morning and are going to bed by 9 o'clock at night. Others of us prefer to get up at 9 or 10 o'clock in the morning and are going to bed at midnight, 1 a.m., right? It's to do with where you phase your wake time. On average, typically, people with bipolar disorder tend to be evening types. They tend to get up later in the morning and they tend to stay up later at night. That's their preferred schedule. And that's fine. This is just a normal thing. Some of us are more morning type and some of us are more evening type. As we get older, we get more morning type. There's a very famous thing that adolescents have trouble at school because they get very evening type for a while. So they get much more evening type, once they hit puberty, and that comes back a bit once they get to be fully adult. So this is all normal. Chronotype runs in families. It's quite strongly genetic. So some families are much more morning type than others. Some families are much more evening type than others. But in bipolar disorder, we can see some consequences of the evening type that is worth flagging. Firstly, it's very important, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a minute, that if you're trying to improve your sleep, it's really useful to work out what your preferred sleeping time is. So if you're trying to get to sleep, if you are an evening type and you're trying to get to sleep at a time that's more moderate, like trying to get to sleep at 10:30, say, when in fact your preferred sleeping time is midnight, you won't sleep well. It will be very difficult and it will be frustrating. And you can, in fact, sort of generate sleep problems if you're trying to sleep at the wrong time. That's the first thing. And if you're an evening type, there can be tension, as we actually see in adolescents with their parents. There can be a tension with other people saying to you, hey, you've got to get up for work in the morning. This job's really important to you. Go to bed. Stop, watching the telly, stop watching Netflix, stop playing the computer game. You have to go to bed. But that can be challenging, is creating that wind down time to get you ready for sleep, bed and sleep. If in fact your preference, your natural style is to be up much later. The other thing that happens for people who are evening types is this sort of chronic thing that they do find it a bit difficult to sync up with the working world. The working world is not very flexible. Actually, it's probably become more flexible, hasn't it, since COVID, and since we do a lot of these things where you don't have to get dressed and leave the house. There is more flexibility, but generally the Western world is very inflexible about when work happens. And if you're someone whose natural style is not to get up till 9 o'clock in the morning, you will find you might, set all the alarms in the world to get yourself up at 7:30 so you can get to work by 9, but you will find that your sleep is still, what we call sleep inertia. You might be up and out of bed, but you're not going to be fully functioning until the time when you would prefer to wake up, actually. Next point, please. And so, not surprisingly, there are some diagnosable sleep problems that people with bipolar disorder have. And one of the take homes that I want you to hear from today's talk is, um, just because someone has bipolar disorder doesn't mean they don't have other diagnosable problems. And sleep problems can be one of those. More than half of people at some time with bipolar disorder will warrant a diagnosis of comorbid insomnia, and that should be treated, right? For a long time, mental health practitioners, and in fact, the Bible of psychiatry, the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, said we need to work out which came first. Was it the mood disorder or the sleep problem? Current thinking says, don't worry about that. We'll never tease that apart. That, as I said right at the start, these things are just connected. Don't worry about that. If there is a significant sleep problem, treat it as a sleep problem, right? There's two problems. There's a bipolar disorder, and if the insomnia is impacting functioning, treat the insomnia. Use an insomnia treatment. Don't just think that the bipolar disorder treatment is going to fix the insomnia, right? The other condition that's really quite common is sleep apnea. And so if you've got a fat neck, and you're a bit overweight, and particularly if you're a male, these are risk factors for sleep apnea. The thing with sleep apnea, of course, is you don't know you have it. You're waking in the night without consciously waking. All you know is you're feeling tired in the daytime. And that's why I mentioned the indicators that you might have that issue if you're feeling tired in the daytime. That does need assessment in a sleep lab. There's no other way to confirm sleep apnea. So that's something you'd go to your doctor about, was we can't self-manage sleep apnea. And the other thing that people commonly report is restless leg syndrome due to medications. And yeah, so that's another diagnosable and treatable sleep problem that we might need to work with if we have bipolar disorder. Next point, please. And this is where it gets a bit tricky. So, we're going to be talking over the next half of this talk about self-management of sleep problems in bipolar disorder. And so, there's lots of really useful tips that are in fact useful ways to improve your sleep. But because I'm talking to people with mood challenges, we always have to keep in mind, unfortunately, that those sleep problems can in fact indicate that the bipolar illness is coming back, that we're starting to slide into an episode. So everything that I'm about to say about things you can do to improve your sleep, we have to add to that. You need to pay close attention to your sleep. And if things are not getting better quickly, then we need to think, okay, this is potentially turning into a problem, and I need to speak to my health practitioner, right? Because sleep problems can predict relapse. So sleep change is the most common. This is self-reported. People, if we ask people, what's the most common thing you see before you have a manic episode? Most people say sleep change, right? It is the most common early warning sign. And it is one of the more common early warning signs of depression. People say, I notice my sleep changing, right? So that's self-report. But then over the last 10 years or so, people have done more objective, following people across time to see if this is true across time, not just retrospectively telling us what happened. And that is also confirming that sleep changes often do come early in the sequence that heads towards an episode, right? And of course, everyone on this call knows that things that disrupt sleep can precipitate episodes. So, having a new baby in the house, time zone travel, seasonal changes, lockdowns during COVID, right? All of those things were associated for some people with increased risk of relapse. So things that disturb sleep can trigger relapses. So I just want to really make that point that we're walking a fine line in this talk. There are things you can do to improve your sleep, but because sleep is so connected to the symptoms of bipolar disorder, we need you to be observant and say, well, is this working? Have I got myself better sleep within a day or two? Or is it actually still getting a bit worse? And sleep and mood will get worse together, hand in hand. And that's the point where self-management, probably we need to postpone it, put up our hand and say, I need an appointment with my health practitioner because something else might be going on that we need to act on. Yeah. And then final point, please, Jake, on this. And so Erin Mahalik and I and her gang in Canada, Crest BD, who I hope many of you have heard of, have done a lot of work on quality of life in bipolar disorder. And one of the things we not surprisingly found that for people with bipolar disorder, sleep is one of the major domains of their quality of life. They don't experience good quality of life unless their sleep is on track. So now let's have a talk about how to improve sleep. And next slide, please. So good, we're going pretty well for time. The average man in the street thinks that we sleep because we're tired. That is, the longer I've been awake, the more likely I am to sleep. Common sense and correct. That is true. The longer you've been awake, the more likely you are to sleep. It's exactly like hunger and thirst. The longer since you've eaten, the hungrier you are, the more you're going to want to eat. Longer since you've had a drink, the thirstier you are, the more you're going to want to have a drink. Exactly like that. We call that a homeostatic process. It just builds up over time. And the sleep drive, the drive to sleep just increases the longer we're awake. We know how that works, actually. What happens, a byproduct of all the energy expenditure we do when we're awake is a chemical called adenosine, and it just keeps growing in the bloodstream as the day goes on. It's just a byproduct of the energy expenditure. Caffeine binds to adenosine, takes it out of the system for a little while, and that's what the burst of energy is, but it only takes it for a little while, so we lose that burst of energy. But that's only one of three things that determine if we're going to go to sleep. The other everyone also knows as well, arousal, the next one, arousal. We can disturb sleep if we're too energized at bedtime, right? So acting in ways that keep us aroused will delay sleep. Now, that arousal could be positive or negative, couldn't it? It could be excitement. I'm really into this. I'm really enjoying my drum practice, or I'm really, which isn't great for the neighbors if we're talking 11 o'clock at night, but, they chose to live here. Or it could be a sort of negative type of arousal, like anxiety, like, what's going to happen tomorrow, or that exam I've got to do, or that new job, right? But arousal disturbs sleep. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. But the third thing that people are not so aware of is humans and every other species have a process which is literally a clock, a biological clock. In humans, it sits in the base of the brain about 5 centimeters in from where I'm pointing, at the front of the hypothalamus, in a little group of cells called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. I only say that to show off that I know that great big word. But the clock is part of getting us to sleep. The clock it leads to the secretion of melatonin that most of you have heard of from the pineal gland. And if we're sleeping well, that melatonin is secreted about an hour and a half before we go to sleep. And it helps us, it helps the sleep process. The thing with the body clock is most of us never notice its function, because it's completely aligned with the homeostatic process, the sleep drive. It matches up. It's meant to match up, and it does match up. The only time we notice it is jet lag, where you've gone to a different time zone, and even though your sleep drive is high, you might have, that you've traveled across multiple time zones, your sleep drive is high. You've been up since, early in the morning. You've had all the hassle of travel and all that stuff, taking your shoes off at the airport. And then you get to your destination, and it's time for you've got an enormous sleep drive, but your body clock is still on your home time and you can't go to sleep. Yeah. Actually, for a lot of people, that problem emerges on the second day in a new time zone. On the first day in a new time zone, the sleep drive is so high that you do get to sleep. It's the second and third day often that people have trouble getting to sleep, because that sleep drive is not quite as much, and the body clock is still on the time of your home location, not your new location. And so to improve sleep, just one more thing about the body clock. That's what's going on with that morningness, eveningness thing. Some people their body clock is set earlier than others. It's the body clock that completely drives that. That body clock is called the circadian system, CIRCADIAN, the circadian system. That's what underpins morningness, eveningness, whether you're an owl or a lark. Next slide, please. So how do we achieve good sleep? We achieve it by making a strong sleep drive, low bedtime arousal, and we help the body clock through regular daily rhythms or routines, right? Now, let me just say one thing about that before we move on. I said we've got this body clock deep in our brain and it helps us predict when we're meant to be going to sleep, right? And it ticks away. And it is really like, it's not a reactive thing. It really is a genuine clock. You know, if you put people in caves for months, we keep cycling on an approximately 24-hour in the absence of any time cues. We keep cycling, sleep, wake, sleep, wake, sleep, wake. And that's the clock telling us when to sleep. Nothing to do with external time cues. But the clock, nature has its job in every species, as I say, is to predict sunrise and sunset. Evolution worked out a long time ago that that is such a fundamental change in the environment that we can't react to it. We have to predict it. Makes sense, right? If I was evolution, I'd do that as well. Um, and the but there's a little qualification to that. Sunrise and sunset happen at different times across the seasonal year. So the clock is adjusted every day by light. It's adjusted. It's a clock, but it's adjusted. And its primary cue for adjustment is light. But in human beings, it also pays attention to the time that we eat, timing of socializing, and timing of exercise. There may be other things, but these are the things that we know of. It's light first, then it's eating, then it's socializing and exercise. Those are the things that the clock pays attention to see if it's on schedule. Remember when we were talking about jet lag? Your clock does eventually adjust. It takes about a week, 10 days to adjust. And that's because it's being synchronized to the new environment. Now, one more thing before we move on. We know that people with mood disorders, particularly bipolar disorder, their clock is very vulnerable to disruption, which is why time zone travel can be challenging for people with bipolar disorder. But because that clock is an open system, right? It's open to information from the environment. That means the way we behave, the way we act, can either support the clock or challenge the clock. Acting in your environment in a routine way, sort of the same pattern of behavior, day by day by day by day, provides a sort of scaffolding for the clock for people whose clock is a bit vulnerable to disruption, right? And so that's that regular daily rhythms idea. Think of routines. The other phrase that you might see, it's in the literature, which I don't think is useful. People talk about social rhythms, but that's what they're referring to. They're talking about routine in your daily behaviors. So let's talk about what this means. Next slide, please, Jake. So let's talk about how we stabilize the body clock with routine. The most important thing you can do is stabilize wake time and bedtime across 7 days of the week. The clock loves that. It's like, you know how babies and small children like routine, and the clock's like that. and dogs and cats, they also like routine. The clock's like that. And the main marker of routine is what time you get up and go to bed. Actually, the evidence suggests the most important is the time you get up. The time you get up is an important cue. And if that's very variable across days, your clock doesn't know what the hell is going on. But if it's stable, we are strengthening that clock function. So we are adding to that third component of sleep quality. Not surprisingly, we also would want you to get sunlight close to waking. And so for most of the year, that's fine. We're getting enough light just by sitting near a window, as I am now. But in the more northern parts of the world and the more southern parts of the world, we might need to augment natural light with a bright light box, or, one of those devices that many of you will have if you live in Canada, for example, in the northern parts of Canada, where there just isn't enough daylight around early in the morning to get that exposure to light. And then, as I said, it's all your activities across the day that we want you to stabilize. So what time do you have breakfast? What time do you have lunch? What time do you have dinner? What time of day do you have your first contact with another person? If we can routinize that, that helps. What time do you get your exercise? If we can routinize that, that's just all information coming into the body clock. So the body clock is confident that it knows what's going on with the pattern of day and night. That's essentially what we're telling it, because that's its job, is to keep track of the pattern of day and night. And then one element of this that I'm just going to quickly mention, because it's really important in bipolar disorder, is that we do want you to be active in the daytime. There's something about, it's kind of like a yin and yang. The more active we are in the daytime, the more prone and prepared we are to withdraw into sleep at night. And so I think of it like a sine curve in mathematics. The higher the amplitude of that sine curve in the daytime, the deeper we drop at night. And so we do want physical activity, outdoor activity, and social activity. It's that daily engagement that's really important as preparation for the body to say, no, I've had enough of that. I'm ready to sleep at night. The only qualification on that, of course, in bipolar disorder is it's not more activity is always better, because for people with bipolar disorder, that can be a bit of a manic ascent. People can get too excited about the activity that they're engaged with. So there is a limit. So we need to just be careful. We can't just say more is better when it comes to people for whom activity can get too extreme. Next slide, please. Then the second part of getting good night's sleep, the sleep drive, all of this is common sense. But as a friend of mine just said the other day, it's common sense, but it may not be common practice. So you might want to check yourself to see if you're napping, which of course, especially napping later in the day, makes it harder for you to go to sleep. You might want to check what time of day is the last time you have a stimulant. For most people, caffeine has to be done with by midday, and other stimulants. We've spoken about getting up at the same time each day, but this is an important one. When you're having sleep problems, just because you didn't sleep that well during the night, we generally recommend that you get up at the same time anyway, right? To keep your sleep drive building. But again, there's that qualification with bipolar disorder. If there's been a couple of nights where you're not getting enough sleep, we don't necessarily want you to be so harsh on yourself that you get out of bed at 7 o'clock because that's the rule, because that actually could be a sign of a process that's not going well and you need some medical input, right? So there's just, again, that qualification there. And I'll just remind you that the sleep drive works based on your preferred time of sleep. So again, I just reiterate, work out what your preferred time of sleep is, because that has to be factored in. Next slide, please. Then there's this really important thing about preparing for sleep. I've seen cats do this. Before they go to sleep, they'll do this sort of walking around in a circle thing, and they're sort of got their claws out and they're getting generally my couch ready to sleep on. So they're kind of cutting it up. I suppose it's getting the dirt ready to soften it for sleep. But humans have a similar thing. People who sleep well have what I call a pathway to sleep that they do every night. A mate of mine was just describing this the other day in a talk. I floss my teeth, which is good on him. I don't do that. I floss my teeth, I clean my teeth, I put on my pajamas, I go to bed, I get the book, and after it's cueing the body that sleep is coming. And if you're not a particularly good sleeper, I encourage you to find such a pathway to sleep and give it a go. The other things we're really conscious of is bright light in the evening. So turning down the lights in the house. The rule that we don't start difficult conversations after dark. It's amazing to me how often people make this mistake. They say, I've just got to tell my partner about that thing I don't like, and I'm going to tell her at 8:30. Really? We're exhausted. She wants to watch Netflix. You're going to say, turn off the Netflix, and we really, no, no. So take that intensity out of your social interactions after dark. Now, as I've said, many people with bipolar disorder have evening tendencies. So it's not easy, actually. A lot easier for morning types to follow this recommendation. But evening types might need to do a bit more work on this. And again, this is where if I was speaking one-on-one to you, we'd be brainstorming. What is it about the excitement of that activity that's so hard to step back from? And we'd be unpacking it, but we can't do that now. Next slide, please. Anxiety is very common for everyone and very common for people with bipolar disorder. Key trick. If you have something you're worried about, you will not successfully problem solve it after dark. What you will do instead is you will worry it. You'll think about the worst possible outcome and you'll ruminate about it. It's just a function of being tired. It's a function of there being no resources to solve your problem, right? This is most vivid if you try and think about challenges in bed, right? It's dark. There's no one there. You're tired. There is literally so you can't think straight. There's literally no problem solving you can do. It will fail. It will turn into a vortex of worry. So my rule for myself and other people that I work with is don't go there. If you find yourself thinking about a problem and it's after dark, it will not work. You write it down or you tell someone, oh, I'm a bit worried about this. I'm going to have to think about it tomorrow. Can we have a chat about this tomorrow? It's just a no-brainer once you think about it. And then adding on top of that, for some people, active relaxation. I know many people have an active relaxation strategy, active rather than passive, right? Netflix is passive. Active relaxation is doing something to deliberately become more relaxed. Mindfulness, meditation, some yoga. Yeah, right? Calming activities. And I just want to flag that, yeah, it's easier said than done. Some people find relaxation itself difficult, but it's a recommendation. Next slide, please. And then this is what's called sleep hygiene advice, just the basics of getting a good night's sleep. The room should be cool, quiet, dark, and you should be uncontactable. Basically, we want to tell the brain that there is nothing that's going to happen for the next 8 or so hours that needs the brain's attention. So that's one of the psychological reasons that people often sleep with an eye mask and earplugs. It not only decreases stimulation into the brain, but it tells the brain, I don't need to be paying attention to the environment. It's like a safety cue for the brain, right? And then bed itself, don't do other stuff in bed. Don't do your homework in bed. Don't do your Netflix in bed. Only sleep and things that lead to sleep. So for some people, that's sex. That's always traditionally the thing that's mentioned here, but obviously that's not part of everybody's life. And for some people, sex isn't conducive to sleep. It's not actually all that much fun. But so sleep in bed and do things that are conducive to sleep. And for some people, that's reading a book, for example. Other people, it's not. Again, individual differences matter. When you're having trouble with sleep, it's really important that we associate bed and sleep. So we don't want you to be in bed awake. So if don't force yourself to go to bed if you're actually not sleepy, like yawning, feeling like sleep is close. just because it's 10:30 and you're tired because you've been busy all day, that's not the same thing as being sleepy. Everyone knows what sleepy feels like, hopefully, and that's when we should be heading to bed. And similarly, our general recommendation is if you wake in the night and you're still awake for 20 minutes or so, you should get up, do some calming activities, which of course would have to be prepared before this happens, a book to read under a soft light, under a rug. But for people with bipolar disorder, again, we just need to be a bit careful because any sleep disturbance can be manicogenic, right? So that recommendation of getting out of bed when you're awake at night, again, we can give it a try, but we have to monitor it very carefully because for people with bipolar disorder, it can be part of a process that's not productive. Next slide, please. And then I'm just very quickly going to mention this. So we've been talking about self-management. We've been saying there are recommendations that are useful for everybody, that are useful for people with bipolar disorder. But people with bipolar disorder have this additional thing of they just need to be mindful that some of the sleep problems can be part of a pathway towards an episode. And so they just need to be mindful of that and realize that the self-management, we can't keep pushing it too long. If it's not kind of working pretty quickly, then we need to call on help. And I'm just mentioning this, and this is what professional help would look like. So CBTI for insomnia. In fact, put up all the points for this, please, Jake, for all this. Yeah. Yeah, thanks. That's great. Yeah, back to, yeah, thank you. So CBTI really contains much of what I've just described to you in sleep management, but it's a bit more assertive about some of those things. So CBTI actually has strict rules about, you have to get out of bed if you're not asleep for 20 minutes. But this is what we really want a professional to oversee, right? And in fact, the most aggressive part of CBTI so people who actually have diagnosable insomnia is what they call sleep restriction, which is counterintuitive. But what it is they say to the person with insomnia, okay, you're currently only getting 5 hours sleep a night. You're only allowed to be in bed for 5 hours. So you can see how that works. It sort of takes the pressure off trying to go to sleep, and then you slowly build it back up. Now, for people with bipolar disorder, we're not happy with them having 5 hours sleep a night. We can't tolerate that, right? It's a risk factor for relapse. So we're a bit concerned about CBTI for bipolar disorder, but with a properly trained professional, that could be investigated as a strategy if it's being very, very carefully monitored. You definitely wouldn't want to do that yourself. And you wouldn't want to do that with a professional who is not familiar with bipolar disorder. If you just go to any psychologist and say, I've got insomnia, I need treatment for insomnia, they may well say, well, okay, whatever, we'll just get you on 6 hours sleep for a while and we'll slowly increase it. Well, with bipolar disorder, we'd be very nervous about doing that. And final slide, please. So just going to make a couple of quick comments that I could talk about this for an hour, but key take home is if the sleep problems don't resolve quickly with self-management, we need to put our hand up and say, this could be part of a relapse process and we need to act on it. And then there's a few other things that we actually don't have time to talk about, but if you just glance down there, there are actually things about, I said right at the start, it depends on the individual. Each of these things are about that. Different people have different meanings to their sleep problem. Is there a trauma process going on here? Are there other disturbances in the house? Individual differences in how the self-compassion works as part of managing sleep problems. It really does matter who the individual is. And final slide, please, Jake. So challenges with sleep are common in bipolar disorder. It is useful to think about what makes sleep work. And there are these 3 processes: arousal at bedtime, sleep drive, that homeostatic, just builds up over time, and the body clock and managing or supporting the body clock through daily routines. These are the core bits of knowledge you need. And following from those things, most things are common sense, but these are the core bits of knowledge you need to self-manage your own sleep. And people who manage their bipolar disorder well, just to make this really clear, tell us that these are the things they do. They tell us sleep really matters to their quality of life. And people who say they're managing their bipolar disorder well, when we unpack what are you doing about sleep, it's these things that are working for them, right? So we've got sort of lived experience evidence that that works. But again, we have to say that if things are not working in terms of self-management, the interaction with the mood symptoms means we can't play around with it, right? We need to act. And just on the final slide, I've got some further work that you can explore. So next slide, please, Jack. So these are great resources so that I recommend you have a look at, which will say pretty much the same thing as I've said today, but there's some lived experience voices, telling stories of how this works for them in detail. There's some more materials, etc. So I hope you found that useful. And as always, I've spoken for too long.
I don't think you did speak for too long. That was amazing, Professor Murray. It's always an honor to hear you talk and hear your valuable insights. And with that being said, we do have time for a question or two. So we're going to get into that. And I'm seeing one question is, how could one avoid hypersomnia between episodes?
Yeah. So one of the things is, well, firstly, I would have to say what is causing the hypersomnia. So hypersomnia presents as sleeping too long, but also not sleeping too long, but feeling tired during the day. So it depends a bit. So this gives me the chance to say something that I didn't say during the talk. A lot of the stuff we're talking about today is literally about behavior change, right? Behavior change is not easy. So I get a bit sick of people doing these talks and acting as if, oh, we just choose to do that behavior and we do it. Really? Do we all get exercise, as much exercise as we want, as we should have? No, the whole world doesn't get as much exercise as they should. It's not easy. When we are encouraging someone on a behavior change path, the phrase I like to use is compassionate discipline, right? It's like good parenting. You need to set boundaries for yourself, but you need to have these boundaries should be soft, not hard.
Mhm.
So, for example, if someone is finding that they're sleeping in too late for their lifestyle, that it's not working for them, they're missing out on contact with people, for example, staying up too late at night, getting out of sync, then I would encourage them to set a wake time that works for them across 7 days a week and tolerate to some extent the tiredness that they're feeling as a result of not getting the sleep that they would prefer. Use the techniques of alarm clock, whatever, getting out of bed promptly in the morning, getting exposure to light, getting that momentum in the day. There are things that, so don't get obsessed with the fact that you feel tired. There are actions we can take that make us feel less tired, right? So moving around, talking to someone, eating breakfast, these things cue the body. The body forgets that it's tired, right? Now, but that's where the compassionate comes in. We want people not to be too rigid with that, right? If one day it's really, really hard to do that, yes, behavior change is hard. And so we need to cut ourselves some slack. So particularly for people who have sort of deep challenges with sleep and mood, we do need the routines, we do need the discipline, but it has to be compassionate discipline, which allows for some variation. And that monitoring that we've been talking about all day today, the monitoring to ask the question, is this working? Is this actually working or not? And do I need my health professional to monitor how this is working for me?
Excellent. So we'll do one more question today, and that is, how would one improve deep sleep?
Yeah, so we've already mentioned that's a great question. So we've mentioned one of the things that I think is most important about that, and that it's actually stuff you do in the daytime. So physical exercise is great, especially uh, is it called anaerobic? Muscle building exercise.
Mhm.
So it's not the walking, running, cycling thing, which is, of course, is also great, but the evidence is strongest for muscle building exercise in the daytime to help to increase the likelihood of deep sleep. Exercise can't be too close to bedtime. For most people, the general recommendation is the arousal of exercise delays sleep. But I also know quite a few people who exercise in the evening, then have a shower, and that's part of quite a strong wind down process. So it actually helps them prepare for sleep. But the general recommendation is we don't do exercise within a couple of hours of sleep. Because the body needs time to calm down from the exercise. But muscle building exercise, is it called anaerobic? Anyway, I don't know.
I think so.
That's
Sounds
yeah,
right.
yeah, that's the one that is particularly good for deepening sleep.
Well, excellent. And with that being said, I want to thank everyone in attendance. And this webinar will be available online at ibpf.org and on our YouTube channel. If you didn't have time to get to your questions today, please email info@ibpf.org and we will look into resources for you. And Professor Murray, we are so, so thankful for you taking the time out of your day to join us and to share your vast knowledge with our audience. Do you have any closing comments?
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to you, Jake. You've been wonderful to work with in this, and the IBF, who I've had contact with for years, and everything they do is good. They do good quality stuff. So I do a lot of sort of psychoeducation, talking to people about bipolar disorder. It's good quality stuff that the IBF does. So it's an honor to be part of your offerings.
Well, thank you so much. And with that being said, I hope everyone has a
Yeah.
lovely day. For those in Australia, it's just getting started, and for those in the United States here, it's winding down a little bit. So we get those body clocks regulated. Have a great day.
See ya.